He was a guardian forged in the fires of distant wars, now seeking a sanctuary in the silence of the mountains. Silas moved through the tall pines with a quiet economy of motion that belied the coiled power in his frame. The Pacific Northwest mist was a constant companion, a damp grey breath that clung to the Douglas firs and gave the air a sharp, clean smell of wet earth and resin. This was his peace, a self-imposed exile from a world of coded transmissions and the metallic tang of expended brass. Here, the only orders he followed were the rhythms of the sun and the seasons. His only partner was Odin, a Belgian Malinois whose sable coat was the color of shadows and whose eyes held the same watchful intelligence as the man he served. The dog was a legacy of his former life, a retired military K9, a weapon of flesh and bone who now spent his days chasing squirrels and sleeping by the hearth. Together, they were two halves of a single, silent soul, two protectors without a charge. Silas had built this cabin with his own hands, each log a prayer for stillness, each joint a testament to a future he was trying to force into existence, a future without the ghosts. But the world he fled had a long memory, and the storm it sent wasn't made of wind and rain. It was made of men. He thought he was done fighting, a weapon holstered and gathering dust. He was wrong. His loyal K9 partner, the guardian who slept at the foot of his bed, was about to find a war that had followed him home, a war hiding in the heart of the coming tempest. What would you do if protecting a stranger meant destroying the very peace you fought so hard to find? Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and may God bless you and your family. The wind began its assault as a low moan through the canyons, a mournful sound that set Odin's ears twitching. The dog rose from his spot by the fire, a low growl vibrating in his deep chest. Silas paused, his hand resting on the worn stock of the hunting rifle he was cleaning. He trusted the dog's senses more than his own. Odin didn't react to animals this way. This was different. This was the scent of man carried on the leading edge of the storm. Silas moved to the window, peering into the darkening woods. The sky had turned a bruised purple-grey, the clouds churning in a violent ballet. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain. The world beyond his clearing was disappearing, being erased by the second. The forecast had called for a significant weather event, but this was something else. This felt biblical, a cleansing, or a burial. The power flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the cabin into the primal gloom of dusk, lit only by the flickering dance of the fireplace. The sanctuary was becoming a cage. He didn't feel fear. Fear was a luxury, an indulgence he'd burned out of himself years ago in the suffocating heat of the sandbox. What he felt was a familiar, unwelcome hum, the low-grade thrum of operational readiness. His body remembered. His mind was already calculating. Wind speed, visibility, temperature drop, a weapon without a target. The storm hit not as an arrival, but as an impact. The wind shrieked, a physical blow against the sturdy logs of the cabin. Snow swirled in a disorienting vortex, a white chaos that consumed the landscape. Inside, the fire roared in the stone hearth, a lone bastion of warmth and light against the siege. Silas moved with practiced calm, checking the seals on the windows, lighting the oil lamps that hung from the rafters. His movements were economical and precise, the ingrained discipline of an operator who knows that wasted energy is a liability. Odin, however, was a portrait of canine anxiety. He paced the length of the cabin, his claws clicking a frantic rhythm on the wooden floorboards. He would stop at the door, whine, then look back at Silas, his intelligent eyes filled with an urgent plea. "Easy, boy," Silas murmured, his voice a low rumble. "It's just the wind." But he knew it wasn't. The dog's agitation was specific, directed. He wasn't just reacting to the storm, he was reacting to something in it, something that didn't belong. The dog let out a sharp, commanding bark. Not a warning, a summons. He scratched at the heavy oak door, his message clear. We have to go out. To go out now, into that maelstrom, was suicide. The temperature had plummeted, and the wind chill would be lethal. Visibility was zero. To get lost was to die. Yet Odin was insistent. In all their years together, through firefights and long, silent patrols, the dog had never been wrong. His senses were a finely tuned instrument that had saved Silas's life more times than he could count. To ignore him now would be to break a sacred trust. It would be a betrayal of their bond, the only truly unbroken thing Silas had left. With a resigned sigh, Silas pulled on his insulated gear. Heavy-duty parka, thermal layers, waterproof shell. He strapped a headlamp to his forehead and clipped a GPS unit to his belt. He grabbed a compact trauma kit from a shelf, a reflex, and stuffed it into a pocket. He looked at the rifle rack by the door, his hand hovering over a familiar, black, military-grade carbine. He hesitated. No, not yet. He took the heavy Magnum revolver instead, its weight a cold, solid comfort in his hand. He opened the door and the storm clawed at him, a blast of ice and fury. Odin didn't hesitate. He plunged into the whiteout, a dark shape swallowed instantly by the blizzard. Silas followed, tethered to the dog by a lifetime of faith, the beam of his headlamp a pathetic spear against an ocean of white. Odin led him not toward the road, but deeper into the forest, up a steep, treacherous ridge. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath, and the snow was already knee-deep. Every step was a battle. He could barely see the dog, a fleeting shadow just at the edge of his light. He was moving, purely on instinct, his own and the dog's. Then Odin stopped. He was barking furiously, digging at a massive snowdrift piled against the roots of a fallen giant. Silas pushed forward, his light cutting across the scene. He saw it then, a sliver of metal, painted a deep, luxurious blue, sticking out of the snow, the roof of an overturned vehicle. Silas's focus narrowed to a pinpoint. The world of wind and snow dissolved, replaced by the ice-cold clarity of a mission. The vehicle, a high-end SUV, was half buried, its chassis twisted. This was no simple accident. The angle was wrong. The vehicle had been run off the road from above, tumbling down the ravine. It was a deliberate act. He knelt, his gloved hands sweeping away snow from the passenger side window. It was shattered. Inside, slumped against the door, was a figure, a woman. Odin whined, a low, keening sound, nudging Silas's hand with his wet nose. The protector's instinct, buried but never gone, surged through Silas. He was no longer a man in exile. He was a first responder, a guardian. He used the butt of his revolver to break away the remaining shards of the safety glass, the sound sharp and brittle against the howl of the wind. He reached inside, his fingers searching for a pulse at her neck. It was there, faint, thready, but there. Hypothermia was setting in. He had minutes, not hours. Getting her out was a brutal physical task. He wrenched the buckled door open with a grunt of exertion, the metal groaning in protest. He carefully unbuckled her seatbelt and eased her out of the vehicle. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp. He saw the gash on her forehead matted with blood and snow, but his trained eyes scanned for other injuries, for the telltale signs of something more sinister. He found them. Dark, circular bruises on her wrists, abrasions that spoke of a struggle, a tear in the fabric of her expensive coat that wasn't from the crash. She had fought. He lifted her into his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her breath was a shallow, frosty puff against his neck. The cabin was a half-mile away, but in this blizzard, it might as well be on another planet. The journey back was a descent into a primal hell. He followed Odin's dark form, placing one foot in front of the other, his own body a shield against the punishing wind. The woman in his arms was a fragile weight, a life he was now responsible for. He didn't question why. In his world, you didn't leave people behind, ever. He stumbled through the door of his sanctuary, kicking it shut against the storm. He laid her gently on the thick bearskin rug in front of the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows across her pale, unconscious face. He stripped off his own soaked outer layers, his mind a checklist of emergency protocols, triage, warmth, assessment. The sanctuary was no longer a place of peace. It was a field hospital. It was a bastion. And as he began to cut away her wet clothes to treat her for hypothermia, he felt a chilling certainty settle deep in his bones. The storm hadn't brought her to him by accident. He had been found. His war had come home, and the first shot had already been fired. He worked with a detached, methodical grace. His hands, which could dismantle a weapon or end a life with brutal efficiency, were now surprisingly gentle. He cut away her soaked, expensive clothing, his gaze clinical, assessing. Multiple contusions, the significant laceration on her forehead, the damning bruises on her wrists. He wrapped her in thick wool blankets, positioning her to absorb the radiant heat from the fire. Odin lay nearby, a silent, watchful sentinel, his head on his paws, his eyes never leaving the woman. As he worked, she began to stir, caught in the twilight of delirium. She muttered, her words fragmented, broken by shivers. The legacy. Croft's legacy. It's all in the silver. Her voice trailed off, her brow furrowing in a pained grimace. Don't let him. The whistle. Croft. The name snagged in Silas's mind. It was familiar. Julian Croft, the tech billionaire, the visionary, the philanthropist. His company, Croft Industries, had a massive, sprawling campus just outside Seattle, a fortress of glass and steel. What did this woman have to do with him? The silver whistle, a strange detail, a child's toy, a code. His thoughts were interrupted by Odin. The dog lifted his head, a low, guttural growl rumbling from his chest. His ears were pinned, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the north-facing window. Silas froze. He moved silently to the window, staying deep in the shadows of the room. He peered through a small gap in the curtains. The snow was still a blinding sheet, but through the chaos he saw it. A light. Not a light. A thermal signature. A small, dark shape hovering unnaturally, cutting through the blizzard's white noise on an infrared spectrum only a predator would look for. A drone. It wasn't a civilian model. He recognized the flight pattern, the compact, military-grade chassis. This was a search asset, but it wasn't sweeping in a grid pattern like a search and rescue operation. It was moving with tactical purpose, clearing sectors, its camera gimbal focused intently on the ground. They weren't looking for a lost hiker. They were hunting a fugitive. His fugitive. The drone hovered for a moment longer, its electronic gaze sweeping over his position, before it moved on, disappearing back into the storm. A cold dread, colder than the wind outside, settled in his gut. They had technology. They had resources. They were organized. This confirmed it. The crash was an assassination attempt. It had failed. And now, the hunters were closing in on their prey. He looked from the window to the unconscious woman by the fire. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a target. And by bringing her into his home, into his sanctuary, he had just painted a target on himself. He walked over to the stone wall of the fireplace, his fingers finding the seams of a loose rock. He pulled it free, revealing a dark, hidden cavity. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the carbine he'd left behind. The M4. His M4. Its familiar weight felt different in his hands now. Not a relic of a past life. It was a tool for the present. A tool for the war that had just been declared. He was no longer Silas, the recluse. He was the operator, the protector, and his sanctuary had just become a fortress. Her eyes opened slowly, the color of a stormy sea, filled with a disoriented fear that was quickly replaced by a sharp, analytical focus. She took in the rustic cabin, the fire, the massive dog watching her, and finally, the man standing in the shadows, holding a military-grade carbine. Her body tensed. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice raspy but strong. There was no panic in it, only a demand for information. "My cabin," Silas said, his tone flat, neutral. "Your SUV went into the ravine. The storm. I found you." She pushed herself up on her elbows, wincing as pain shot through her. Her gaze was sharp, missing nothing. She saw the way he stood, the way he held the weapon, the disciplined calm in his eyes. "You're military," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I was," he corrected, the past tense a wall he tried to keep between who he was and who he is. "Who are you?" "My name is Aris Thorne." She paused, her eyes challenging him. "Dr. Aris Thorne." The name clicked. Dr. Aris Thorne. A brilliant but controversial bioethicist who had recently resigned from a senior research position at Croft Industries, citing irreconcilable ethical differences. It had been a minor story in the financial news, a blip on the radar. Now it was the centerpiece of a manhunt in a blizzard. "You mentioned a name," Silas said, his voice low. "Croft." Aris's jaw tightened. "Julian Croft didn't like my resignation. He doesn't like loose ends." "He tried to kill you," Silas stated, the pieces slotting into place. "His security team ran me off the road. I was on my way to meet a journalist. I have everything." "Everything." "Proof, data, internal communications, Croft's legacy project. It's a lie. It's not philanthropy. It's human trials. Illegal ones. He's weaponizing genetic therapies and selling them on the black market. He's built a private empire on suffering." The raw fury in her voice was potent. This was personal. "The evidence," Silas pressed. "Where is it?" "I have it on a micro drive," she said, her hand instinctively going to her neck, then her pockets, her face falling. It was on a chain, disguised. A silver whistle. The silver whistle. It wasn't a code. It was the objective. "I must have lost it in the crash." She looked at him, the full weight of their situation dawning on her. They won't stop. They'll scour that entire mountain until they find it, and they'll eliminate anyone who gets in their way. Silas looked at Aris, then at Odin, then at the rifle in his hands. His meticulously constructed piece was shattered. The ghosts he had run from were nothing compared to the flesh and blood monsters now hunting in his woods. He had a choice. He could force her out, back into the storm, and pray they didn't connect her to him. He could wash his hands of it, preserve his sanctuary, or he could accept the truth. The sanctuary was already gone. It had vanished the moment he carried her across the threshold. All that was left was the fortress. And a fortress needed a protector. "They know you survived the crash," he said, his voice dropping into the quiet, authoritative tone of command. "They sent a drone. They're hunting. But this is my mountain. They are in my world now." He wasn't just sheltering a victim anymore. He was protecting the mission. He was protecting the truth. He was protecting his charge. He was a guardian again. The decision made, the cabin transformed. What was once a haven of quiet reflection became a tactical operations center. Silas moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, every action imbued with years of ingrained training. He barred the heavy oak door with a thick iron beam. He shuttered the windows, not just closing the curtains, but bolting heavy wooden planks across them, plunging the room into a near-total darkness broken only by the hungry flames in the hearth and the cool, efficient beams of battery-powered lanterns. The world outside was erased. Now, this room was the world. This was the kill box. Iris watched him, a mixture of awe and apprehension on her face. She had seen professional soldiers before, but this was different. He wasn't just a soldier. He was an apex predator preparing his den. He was a weapon unto himself. "You've done this before," she said, her voice quiet in the sudden stillness. Silas didn't look up from his work. He was laying out his gear on the large wooden dining table, a stark juxtaposition of lethal modernity against rustic craftsmanship. The M4 carbine, several magazines of 5.56mm rounds, the heavy revolver, a combat knife with a non-reflective blade, a pair of night vision goggles, a small satellite phone. It wasn't an arsenal, but in his hands, it was more than enough. "I have," he said, the words carrying a weight she couldn't begin to comprehend. He turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. The clinical detachment was gone, replaced by an intense, focused energy. "You have a military background," he stated, echoing her earlier observation. "Your posture, the way you assess threats. You're not just a doctor." A flicker of surprise, then respect, crossed her face. "Army Ranger. Served 2 tours as a medic attached to a special reconnaissance unit before I went to medical school. I know how to handle myself." "Good," Silas said, a fraction of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Because survival is not a spectator sport." He pushed a spare handgun, a compact 9mm, across the table toward her. "Can you use this?" She picked it up, her grip sure and familiar. She checked the magazine, cleared the chamber, and gave the slide a practiced rack. The sound was deafeningly loud in the small cabin. "Yes," she said simply. An understanding passed between them. They were no longer a protector and a victim. They were a team, a unit of 2, 3, counting the silent, 4-legged sentinel watching them from the shadows. "They'll come for the whistle first," Silas strategized, his voice low and urgent. "They'll secure the crash site and search. That's our window. We can't stay here. This cabin is a coffin. They'll surround it and wait us out. We have to move. We have to get to that whistle before they do." Eris nodded, her mind racing. "It's our only leverage. Without it, it's just my word against Julian Croft's. No one would believe me. We'd be hunted for the rest of our lives." "It's more than leverage," Silas countered, his gaze hard as flint. "It's the objective. We secure it, we get it to your contact, and we expose him. The mission isn't to survive. The mission is to win." He looked at Odin, who sat patiently, awaiting his command. Odin will find it. His nose can pinpoint a single spent casing under a foot of snow. A silver whistle will be easy. He turned back to Aris. But we have to go back out there, back to the crash site, and this time we won't be avoiding them. We'll be going right through them. The Protector had a plan. The fortress was about to become a Trojan horse. The storm began to break with the false dawn, its fury receding into a sullen, exhausted silence. A thick, heavy fog replaced the blizzard, blanketing the mountains in a ghostly shroud. It was a gift. The fog was cover, a cloak of invisibility that thermal imaging couldn't entirely defeat. It was their moment. "Time to move," Silas announced, his voice a low command that cut through the quiet cabin. They were geared up, dressed in layers. Silas's dark, tactical gear, a stark contrast to the improvised winter clothing he'd found for Aris. He handed her a pair of snowshoes. "Stay close. Follow my steps exactly. Make no sound." Aris nodded, her face set in a grim mask of determination. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce resolve. She was no longer just a scientist. She was the ranger she used to be, her training rising from the depths of her memory like a forgotten language. Silas gave Odin a series of quiet hand signals. The dog responded instantly, his body low to the ground, a shadow moving toward the door. Silas cracked it open, peering out. The world was a uniform, pearlescent grey. Visibility was less than 20 feet. Perfect. They slipped out of the cabin, melting into the fog like ghosts. The cold was brutal, a sharp, biting presence that seeped into their bones. The silence of the snow-covered forest was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of their snowshoes. Silas moved with a preternatural awareness, his head on a constant, slow swivel, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of white. He was a part of the landscape, his senses extended out into the mist. Odin ranged ahead, a phantom scout, his nose to the ground, constantly testing the air. Every few minutes, he would freeze, look back, and wait for Silas's signal before moving on. They were a perfectly synchronized team, communicating without a single sound. The half-mile trek to the crash site felt like 100 miles. Every snapped twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. Every gust of wind whispering through the pines sounded like a pursuing footstep. The tension was a physical thing, a tightening coil in Silas's chest. He could feel the hunters. He knew they were out there, sweeping the woods, their frustration mounting. As they neared the ravine, Odin suddenly dropped to the ground, completely still. One paw lifted. The signal. Contact. Silas held up a hand, and Aris froze behind him. He sank into a crouch, pulling her down with him behind the broad trunk of an ancient cedar. He peered around the edge, his eyes straining to pierce the fog. He saw them. Two figures, clad in state-of-the-art white winter camouflage, moving slowly along the ridge above the crash site. They carried suppressed carbines, held at a low ready. Professionals, not security guards, mercenaries. Their movements were tactical, disciplined. They were clearing the area with methodical precision. Silas watched them, his mind a rapid-fire calculator of angles, distances, and probabilities. There were only two, a scout team. The main force was likely at the vehicle itself. He looked at Aris, then pointed to his eyes, then to the two men. She nodded her understanding. He then pointed to Odin, gave a subtle hand gesture, a circling motion, and pointed off to the left. The dog understood instantly. Create a diversion. He slunk away, a shadow within a shadow, disappearing into the fog without a sound. Silas drew his combat knife. The rifle was too loud, even suppressed. This had to be silent. This had to be final. He waited, his breathing slow and controlled, his body a compressed spring of violent potential. A moment later, a sharp bark echoed from the woods to the left. The two mercenaries stopped, their weapons snapping up, pointing toward the sound. A deer, a wolf. They communicated with quick, clipped hand signals, one gesturing for the other to hold position while he went to investigate. He moved away from his partner toward the sound of the bark. It was the separation Silas was waiting for. The protector was now the hunter. The mercenary moved cautiously toward the sound Odin had made, his carbine held tight against his shoulder, his eyes scanning the impenetrable grey. He was well trained, but the mountain was not his element. The oppressive silence, the disorienting fog, it was playing on his nerves. He took another step, and Silas exploded from behind a snow-laden fir tree. It wasn't a fight. It was a removal. Silas moved with the horrifying speed of a striking snake. One hand clamped over the man's mouth, stifling his cry, while the other drove the combat knife into the vulnerable spot just below his helmet, severing the spinal cord. The man went limp instantly, a dead weight. Silas lowered him silently to the ground, pulling the knife free and wiping it clean on the man's white camo. He was a weapon without a target no more. He had a target now. He looked back toward the second mercenary. The man was growing anxious, peering into the fog, calling his partner's name in a hushed, urgent whisper. "Marco. Status." Silence was his only answer. Aris, still hidden behind the cedar, watched in stunned silence. She had seen violence before, but this was different. This was a lethal art form, executed with a chilling lack of passion. It was the work of a true operator. Silas gave her a quick hand signal. "Stay put." He began to circle, using the terrain, moving through the deep snow with an unnatural quietness. He was a ghost, a predator stalking its prey in the mist. The remaining mercenary heard something, a slight whisper of nylon against a branch, and spun around, his weapon raised. But Silas was already there. He didn't use the knife this time. He slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's temple. A dull thud, and the man crumpled to the ground, unconscious but alive. Silas preferred not to kill unless necessary, but he would without hesitation. He quickly disarmed the man, binding his hands and feet with his own zip ties, and gagged him with a strip of cloth. A prisoner, an asset, information. Odin reappeared at his side as silently as he had vanished, nudging his hand. Silas gave the dog's head a rough pat. "Good boy." He turned his attention to the ravine. The crash site was just below. He could hear the low murmur of voices, the crunch of boots on snow. The main force. He crept to the edge of the ridge, Aris following close behind. They peered down. 3 more men were at the overturned SUV, their search methodical and increasingly frantic. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a command presence, was barking orders into a radio. "Grid 7 is clear. Nothing. Expand the search perimeter. I want that asset found. Croft wants it yesterday." The leader. The foil. Silas's gaze swept the scene, his tactical brain processing the information. 3 hostiles. Open ground around the vehicle. The silver whistle could be anywhere, buried under the fresh snow. A frontal assault was suicide. He looked at Odin. The dog was already straining, his nose twitching, pointed directly at a spot near the vehicle's shattered front windshield. He could smell it. Silas knew they had one chance. It had to be fast. Oh, shock of violence and speed. He looked at Aris, his eyes conveying the plan. I'll draw their fire. When they're focused on me, you move. Get the whistle. Odin will show you where. Be ready to run. Aris's heart hammered in her chest, but she nodded, her hand gripping the 9mm pistol. Just tell me when. Silas took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He was about to step out of the shadows and declare himself. The Protector was done hiding. The Guardian was going on the offensive. He raised his rifle. Now! Silas opened fire. Not a wild spray of bullets, but 2 precise, controlled shots. They weren't aimed to kill. They were aimed to disrupt. One bullet slammed into the engine block of the SUV, the metallic clang echoing through the silent woods. The second shattered the radio out of the leader's hand, sending him staggering back with a cry of surprise and pain. Chaos erupted. The 3 mercenaries dove for cover, their training taking over. Contact! Ridgeline! Northeast! The leader screamed, clutching his stinging hand. They returned fire, their suppressed weapons spitting silent flashes of flame toward Silas's position. But Silas was already gone. He had fired and moved, a phantom on the ridge, using the fog and trees as his shield. He laid down suppressive fire from a new position, forcing their heads down, pinning them behind the wrecked vehicle. That was Aris's cue. While the mercenaries were focused on the unseen shooter on the ridge, she broke from cover, sprinting down the snowy embankment with Odin at her heels. She was a blur of motion, her ranger training kicking in, her feet finding purchase in the deep snow. She moved low and fast, the 9mm held tight in a 2-handed grip. Odin was a sable streak, making a direct line for the front of the SUV. He began digging frantically at the snow, just as Silas had known he would. The mercenary leader, a man named Kale, saw the movement. "We've got another one, flanker," he yelled to one of his men. The man broke from cover, raising his rifle to fire at Aris. But from the ridge, another shot rang out. Silas's aim was true. The bullet hit the mercenary high in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow with a grunt of pain. One down. Eris reached the spot where Odin was digging. Her gloved fingers plunged into the icy snow, searching desperately. Odin whined, nudging her hand. She felt it. A small, cold, metallic object. The silver whistle. She closed her hand around it, a surge of triumph cutting through her fear. "I have it," she yelled. "Good," Silas's voice called back from the fog. "Now get out of there." Kyle, the leader, was a seasoned professional. He realized he was being played. This wasn't a random attack. It was a coordinated recovery. Enraged, he rose from behind the SUV, ignoring Silas's suppressive fire, and charged directly at Aris. He was a bull of a man, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Aris raised her pistol, but he was too close. He slammed into her, sending them both tumbling into the snow. The whistle flew from her grasp. Odin, seeing his new pack member attacked, launched himself at Kale. He was a blur of fury, teeth, and muscle. The dog latched onto Kale's arm, his growls savage. Kale roared in pain and rage, trying to shake the dog off, but Odin's grip was like a steel clamp. The third mercenary saw his leader in trouble and moved to help, but Silas was ready. He shifted his aim, a cold and simple calculation. Threat, neutralize. He squeezed the trigger. The third man fell without a sound, a dark stain spreading on his white camouflage. Kale, finally wrenching his arm free from Odin's jaws, scrambled for the fallen whistle. But Silas was already descending the ridge, moving with the fluid grace of a hunter closing in for the kill. He landed silently in the snow behind Kale. The mercenary leader sensed the movement and spun around, his face a mask of snarling fury. For a moment, the two men faced each other, the corporate enforcer and the lone protector, the foil and the hero. The battle for the whistle was over. The war for the legacy had just begun. Kale lunged, not with a firearm, but with a combat knife he'd drawn from a sheath on his vest. He was fast, brutally efficient. But Silas was faster. He parried the knife thrust with the barrel of his rifle, the clang of steel on steel sharp in the cold air. He followed through with a vicious butt stroke to Kyle's jaw, staggering the bigger man. This was Silas's world. Close quarters, a dance of violence he knew intimately. Kyle recovered quickly, his eyes burning with cold, concentrated rage. He was no mere soldier. He was a specialist, Croft's personal solution to intractable problems. He came at Silas again, a whirlwind of precise, deadly strikes. But it was like fighting a shadow. Silas flowed around him, deflecting, blocking, using Kale's own momentum against him. While they fought, Aris scrambled through the snow, her eyes locked on the prize, the silver whistle. It lay half-buried a few feet away, glinting against the white. She crawled toward it, her body aching, every muscle screaming in protest. The fight between Silas and Kale was brutal and primal. It was a contest of two wills, two masters of their violent craft. Kale was stronger, a battering ram of muscle. Silas was more fluid, more economical, every movement with a purpose. He disarmed Kale, sending the knife spinning into the snow, and the fight devolved into raw, hand-to-hand combat. Fists and elbows flew. They crashed against the side of the wrecked SUV, the metal groaning under their impact. Odin circled them, a low growl in his throat, waiting for an opening to protect his master. Aris finally reached the whistle. Her fingers closed around it. She had it. She looked up just in time to see Kyle gain a momentary advantage, slamming Silas against the vehicle and pinning him. Kyle's hands went for Silas's throat. Silas fought back, but the bigger man's weight and leverage were too much. His vision began to tunnel. Aris didn't hesitate. She raised the 9mm pistol, her hand shaking, but her aim steady. She had a clear shot at Kyle's back, but a voice inside her, the doctor, the healer, screamed no. Another part of her, the ranger, the survivor, screamed yes. She chose survival. Before she could fire, Odin acted. The dog, seeing his master in mortal danger, shot forward and sank his teeth deep into Kale's thigh. Kale screamed, a raw, agonized sound, his grip on Silas's throat faltering for a split second. It was the only opening Silas needed. He drove his knee hard into Kale's groin and, as the man doubled over in agony, Silas brought his clasped hands down on the back of his neck in a devastating rabbit punch. Kale collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, unconscious. Silence descended once more upon the ravine, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing and Odin's low growl. Silas leaned against the SUV, taking deep, shuddering breaths. He was bruised, battered, but alive. He looked at Aris, who was holding the whistle up as if it were a holy relic. Then he looked at the two unconscious mercenaries and the two he had been forced to kill. The cost of this victory was written in the snow. They couldn't stay there. Reinforcements would come. "We need to go," Silas said, his voice strained. "There's a place. An old ranger lookout tower. High ground, defensible." He retrieved the captured mercenaries' sat phone and a few of their spare magazines. Assets. He looked at Aris, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "You did good, Doc." Aris gave him a weak, tired smile. "You too, SEAL." They were a team, forged in the crucible of the storm. They gathered their gear and the precious silver whistle, leaving the scene of carnage behind. They moved deeper into the wilderness, into the heart of Silas's territory, with the evidence that could topple an empire clutched in their hands. They had won the battle, but they both knew Croft's war was far from over. The real fight was just beginning. The old Ranger Tower was a skeleton of wood and steel perched on the highest peak in the area, a forgotten sentinel from a bygone era. It was cold, exposed, and drafty, but it offered what Silas prized above all else, a 360-degree field of view, sanctuary through vigilance. While Aris, her adrenaline fading, huddled under a blanket, Silas got to work. He used a small, portable power cell taken from the mercenaries' gear to boot up a ruggedized tablet, also liberated from their equipment. The silver whistle wasn't just a micro-drive housing. It was a key, a sophisticated piece of military-grade encryption hardware. Aris directed him through the interface, her voice gaining strength as her focus shifted from survival to her mission. "The drive is partitioned," she explained, her breath misting in the cold air. "The real data is hidden behind layers of decoy files. Croft is arrogant, but he's not stupid." After several tense minutes of inputting codes and biometric-linked passwords that Aris provided, a file folder unlocked. Its name was simple: Legacy. Silas opened it. What they found was worse than Aris had even described. It wasn't just illegal trials. It was a comprehensive program of human weaponization. There were videos, clinical, horrifying footage of subjects being injected with experimental gene therapies. Some showed men developing terrifying strength and aggression before their bodies broke down in catastrophic cellular decay. Others showed enhanced cognitive abilities that quickly descended into madness. There were financial records, meticulously detailed, tracking payments to shell corporations and offshore accounts, linking Croft Industries to rogue nations and terrorist organizations. He was selling his failures as bioweapons and planning to sell his successes to the highest bidder. But the most damning file was a personal video log from Julian Croft himself. His face filled the screen, smug and self-satisfied. "The progenitors were a necessary failure," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sacrifices for the greater good, my greater good. Legacy isn't about what you give to the world, it's about the mark you leave upon it. My mark will be the redefinition of human potential. I will be the new architect of man. History will remember me not as a businessman, but as a god." Silas felt a cold, familiar rage build inside him. He had seen this kind of hubris before, in warlords and despots who believed their ambition gave them the right to play God with human lives. He had spent his life fighting men like Croft. He had just never expected to find one hiding in plain sight, celebrated as a captain of industry. Aris watched his face as he absorbed the information. She saw the quiet, stoic mask crack, revealing the furnace of righteous fury beneath. "Now you see," she said softly. "Now you understand why I couldn't let it go." Silas looked from the screen to her, then to Odin, who rested his head on Silas's knee, sensing his master's turmoil. His sanctuary had been invaded. His peace had been shattered. But in its place, something else had taken root. Purpose. The quiet life he had sought was a retreat from a world he no longer understood. But this he understood. This was evil, pure and simple. This was a line that could not be crossed. The mission was no longer about protecting Aris or surviving the next 24 hours. The mission was to burn Croft's legacy to the ground. "We have to transmit this," Silas said, his voice hard as iron. "Now, before they find us." He looked at the captured sat phone. It was their only way out, their only weapon left, but using it would be like firing a flare in the dead of night. It would pinpoint their exact location. It would bring the rest of Croft's hunters down on them like a hammer. It was a choice: hunker down and wait, or go on the offensive and face the consequences. For the guardian of the mountain, there was no choice at all. He was a protector, and it was time to protect everyone. The upload was agonizingly slow. The sat phone's connection was weak, the data packet massive. Each percentage point that crawled across the tablet's screen felt like a victory and a tightening of the noose. Silas didn't watch the progress bar. He watched the horizon. He stood at the window of the lookout tower, his rifle resting on the sill, his eyes scanning the endless sea of snow-dusted trees below. He was a statue of lethal patience. Aris monitored the upload, her knuckles white as she gripped the tablet. Odin lay at Silas's feet, his ears twitching, sampling the wind for any sound that was out of place. The three of them were a silent tableau of defiance. 70%, Aris whispered, the tension in her voice thick enough to cut with a knife. Silas didn't respond. He had seen them, 2 of them, black shapes moving against the white snow at the base of the peak. They were moving fast, with the confident stride of men who knew their target's location. The transmission had done its work. The flare had been seen. "We have company," Silas said, his voice unnervingly calm. 2, maybe more, approaching from the south. Aris's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "How much time?" "Not enough." Silas turned from the window, his movements deliberate. The final stand. He had been in situations like this before, outnumbered, outgunned, with no extraction on the horizon. Survival was a matter of geometry and violence. He pointed to a trap door in the floor. "There's a cellar. Food supplies. It's reinforced. When I tell you, you and Odin go down there and you bolt it from the inside. Do not open it until I come for you, or until it's over." "Silas, no," Aris protested. "I can fight. I can help." "Your job is to protect that data," he countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "If they get that tablet, all of this was for nothing. You are the mission. I am the shield. Go." His authority was absolute. It was the voice of a commander who had made life and death decisions under fire. Reluctantly, Aris nodded, her eyes glistening. She grabbed the tablet. 95%. Footsteps crunched on the wooden stairs outside the tower. They were here. "Go now," Silas commanded. Aris scrambled toward the trapdoor, pulling Odin with her. The dog looked back at Silas, whining, torn between his 2 masters. "Go with her, boy," Silas ordered. "Protect her." With a final, pained look, Odin followed Aris down into the cellar. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and the sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place echoed from below. The upload complete notification chimed softly on the tablet, a small, triumphant sound in the darkness of the cellar. The door to the tower burst open. Kyle stood there, his face a swollen, bruised mask of hatred. Behind him were 2 more mercenaries, their weapons raised. Kyle's arm was in a makeshift sling, and he had a pronounced limp from Odin's bite, but his eyes were filled with a murderous fire. "Nowhere left to run, Seal," Kyle snarled. Croft sends his regards. He wants the drive, and he wants your head." Silas stood alone in the center of the room, his rifle held at a low ready. He was calm, focused. He was a protector standing his ground, a guardian at the gate of his sanctuary. "You can tell Croft," Silas said, his voice a low, cold whisper as he raised his rifle, "to come and get them himself." The room exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. The small room became a whirlwind of motion and violence. Silas fired first, a double tap to the chest of the mercenary on the right, driving him back out the door and into the snow. He spun left, using the central support column of the tower for cover, as Kyle and the remaining mercenary opened up, their bullets tearing splinters from the old wood. The geometry of the fight. Use cover, control angles, make every shot count. He peered around the column and put a single, precise round through the second mercenary's knee, dropping him to the ground screaming. Now it was just him and Kale. Kale was a berserker. Fueled by pain and rage, he charged forward, firing his weapon wildly, forcing Silas back. Silas returned fire, but Kale was like a man possessed, ignoring the rounds that glanced off his body armor. He closed the distance, his weapon empty, and slammed into Silas, driving him back against the far wall. The fight became intimate and brutal again. Kale's raw strength against Silas's technical skill. They were two sides of the same coin, two men forged in violence. Kyle's hands closed around Silas's rifle, trying to wrench it away. They struggled for control of the weapon, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "You cost me a lot of money," Kyle grunted, his face inches from Silas's. "You cost me my reputation." "You chose the wrong side," Silas countered, driving his head forward in a vicious headbutt that broke Kyle's nose with a sickening crunch. Kyle staggered back, blood pouring down his face, but he just laughed, a horrifying, gurgling sound. "There are no sides, only winners and losers." He lunged again, but this time Silas was ready. He let Kale's momentum carry him past, then spun and drove his combat knife into the exposed gap in Kyle's armor at his side. Kyle roared, a wounded animal, and swiped at Silas, his hand catching Silas across the chest and sending him stumbling. Silas felt a sharp, searing pain in his side. He looked down. Kyle had managed to pull his own knife, and the blade had sliced deep into Silas's ribs. The wound was serious. He was losing blood. Below, in the cellar, Aris heard the struggle. She heard the grunts of pain, the crash of bodies against the floorboards above. Odin was pacing frantically, whining, his protective instincts at war with Silas's command to stay. Kale advanced on Silas, a bloody, triumphant grin on his face. "Looks like I win after all," he sneered, raising his knife for the final blow. Suddenly, a sound from below, the scraping of a bolt. The trapdoor flew open, and Odin launched himself out of the darkness like a fur-covered missile. He hit Kale square in the chest, all 70 pounds of muscle and fury, sending the big man flying backward. Kale crashed through the rotten wood of the tower wall and plummeted into the snow 20 feet below, with a final, choked-off scream. Silence. Silas slumped against the wall, pressing his hand against the bleeding wound in his side. Odin rushed to him, licking his face, nudging him, a low whine of concern in his throat. Eris emerged from the cellar, the tablet clutched in her hand, her face pale. She saw Silas, the blood, and her doctor's instincts took over. She was at his side in an instant, tearing cloth to make a pressure bandage. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden rays across the snow. The battle was over. The mercenaries were neutralized. The evidence was safe. Silas looked out the hole in the wall. The world was quiet again. He had done it. He had protected his charge. He had defended his sanctuary. He looked at Aris, then down at the loyal dog at his side. His pack. He had found a new purpose, not in a place of peace, but in the heart of a just war. He had found his true sanctuary not in solitude, but in loyalty and protection. He had found his war, a war for a legacy of hope, not of greed. He was a guardian, a protector, with his loyal partner at his side. A new mission, a new dawn. If this story of loyalty and purpose has moved you, comment Amen below. We pray that you and your loved ones are always protected. God blesses you and your families.